Gene Hackman, a wealthy billionaire, accepted a bet to marry an ugly black woman. However, he had no idea that this agreement would change his life forever. "You ever get bored, Gene?" Emmett Whitman swirled the bourbon in his glass, the dim light of the penthouse reflecting off the amber liquid. He leaned against the marble bar, his smirk lazy, knowing. Gene Hackman, billionaire, king of Wall Street, master of every game he played, arched a brow. At 43, he had everything: money, power, influence. The world bent to him, not the other way around. Manhattan was his playground, its skyline a testament to his success. He lived in the kind of luxury most men only dreamed of, but he wore it like an old suit. Comfortable, expected, almost unremarkable now. "Bored?" Gene chuckled, sipping his own drink. "That's a poor man's problem." Emmett laughed, shaking his head. "Nah, that's a man without a challenge problem. You've got everything, don't you? Power, money, women falling at your feet. Hell, you probably know what stock's gonna rise next month before the damn CEO does." He leaned in, voice dropping. "But tell me something. When was the last time something actually surprised you?" Gene didn't answer. Because the truth was, nothing did. Not in years. He'd built his life on control, on predicting moves before anyone even thought to make them. Deals, negotiations, even relationships. They all bent to his will. He was always 3 steps ahead. That's what made him Gene Hackman. That's what made him untouchable. Emmett saw the flicker of silence and pounced. "I got a bet for you." Gene smirked, amused. "You? Betting against me? You must be drinking something stronger than that bourbon." But Emmett was serious now, eyes glinting like a man who knew he had the upper hand. "You always date the same type. Model thin, polished, barely a thought in their pretty little heads beyond the next Chanel drop. Predictable." He took a slow sip, then set the glass down. "I bet you wouldn't last 6 months married to a woman who doesn't fit your world." Gene raised a brow. "Define doesn't fit." Emmett grinned. "Not rich, not refined, not the kind of woman who spends half her day at the spa and the other half choosing a dinner reservation. I'm talking real, tough. Someone who'd rather spend her time fighting for a cause than worrying about the right shade of lipstick." Gene's smirk didn't falter. "And what do I get if I win?" $50 million. Emmett let the number hang in the air. "Invested straight into Hackman Enterprises. No strings." Gene let out a slow, measured breath. 50 million was pocket change to him, but this wasn't about the money. It was about the game, the challenge. He set his glass down. "You've got a deal." Gene didn't waste time. The next morning, he called Samantha, his assistant. Efficient, ruthless, the kind of woman who could organize a hostile takeover and a charity gala in the same afternoon. "I need a name," he said, barely looking up from his laptop as she stepped into his office. Samantha raised an eyebrow. "A name?" "A woman. Not my usual type." He waved a hand dismissively. "Someone grounded down to earth, whatever that means. Someone outside of this world." She studied him, the faintest hint of amusement in her gaze. "And how authentic does this need to be?" "It's real enough," he said. "Marriage. 6 months. No loopholes." Samantha gave a slow nod, then turned on her heel. "Give me a few hours." Gene went back to his work, already mentally preparing for the selection process like it was a business acquisition. He'd pick someone, make an offer they couldn't refuse, and see it through. Simple. Except when Samantha returned, she slid a folder onto his desk and said a name that made him pause. "Ellie James." He glanced up. Who? Social worker. Runs a non-profit called Rise Up. Samantha took a seat across from him. Works with struggling communities, fights for housing rights, education reform. The real deal. She tilted her head. She's also... Jean opened the folder and saw. Ellie James wasn't the woman he usually pursued. She wasn't sleek, polished, effortless beauty. She was striking in a different way, full-figured, confident, a kind of presence that demanded attention without asking for it. Her eyes, dark and sharp, didn't belong to someone who played games. Jean smirked. Perfect. He arranged a meeting. Not under false pretenses. Gene Hackman never lied. He just framed things in a way that suited him. Ellie James sat in the back seat of the cab, watching the city blur past, her fingers drumming absently against her knee. The invitation had come unexpectedly, direct and to the point. Gene Hackman requests a meeting to discuss potential funding for Rise Up. She wasn't naive. A man like Gene Hackman didn't suddenly develop an interest in grassroots non-profits. Billionaires didn't invest in causes unless there was something in it for them. And yet, here she was, heading straight into his territory because money like his could change lives. Real lives, not just balance sheets. The cab pulled up to a sleek glass skyscraper, its towering structure gleaming under the morning sun. Ellie exhaled slowly before stepping out. The lobby was pristine, quiet in that expensive, controlled way. Polished floors, soft murmurs, the occasional click of designer heels against marble. By the time she reached the top floor, she had settled into herself, her shoulders squared, her expression unreadable. Gene Hackman's office was as much a statement as the man himself. Sharp angles, minimalist design, a panoramic view of Manhattan stretching endlessly behind him. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, hands steepled together, watching her with that same unreadable smirk. She didn't sit. "Mr. Hackman," she greeted coolly. "Ms. James," he returned, rising smoothly, offering a hand she didn't take. Amusement flickered in his gaze before he gestured toward a chair. Reluctantly, she sat. "You're a busy woman, so I'll get straight to the point," Gene said, settling back into his chair like a man who had never once been rushed. "I'd like to make you an offer." Ellie folded her arms, her wariness sharpening. "I thought this was about a donation." "It is," he said easily. "And more." There was something in the way he said it, too controlled, too calculated. "I need a wife." The words landed like a slap, and for a second Ellie could only blink. Then she let out a dry, incredulous laugh. "Excuse me?" Gene didn't flinch. "I need a wife. For 6 months, strictly contractual. No emotions, no expectations, and in return, I'll fund Rise Up at a level you've never dreamed of." Ellie stared at him. This was a joke. Had to be. "Are you serious?" "Always." She searched his face, looking for some sign of insincerity, some crack in that smooth, polished exterior. But Gene Hackman was as composed as ever, his blue eyes steady, waiting. She shook her head. "You think you can just buy me?" "No," he said smoothly. "I think I can make you an offer that benefits us both." Ellie exhaled sharply, pushing back in her chair. "You have lost your damn mind." Gene didn't seem offended. If anything, the corner of his mouth twitched like he'd expected her reaction. "Why?" she demanded. "What could possibly make a man like you want a fake marriage?" Gene leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Public image," he said simply. "My reputation is, let's say, selective. Investors want to see a more human side. A man grounded in something other than stock prices. He tilted his head slightly. And you, Miss James, are the perfect contrast to everything they think they know about me. Ellie felt something hot and sharp flare in her chest. Anger, disbelief, something close to insult. And what makes you think I'd be interested in humiliating myself like that? Jean's expression didn't change. Because I know what rise up means to you. And I know how hard funding is to come by. The words stung, not because they were false, but because they were true. Ellie had spent years scraping by, chasing grants, pleading with donors who threw pocket change at her, while spending millions on charity galas that didn't actually change a damn thing. She knew what she could do with real resources, how many homes she could save, how many kids she could put through school. And Jean Hackman was dangling that power right in front of her. For a moment, she let herself imagine it. The expansion, the community centers, the security that came from knowing she wouldn't have to fight for every dollar. It was intoxicating. Then she clenched her jaw. "And what happens when this 6 months is over?" she asked, voice tight. Jean shrugged. "You walk away with a fully funded organization. I walk away with a refined image. Everyone wins." Ellie's stomach churned. It was so transactional, so calculated. Her entire life had been about fighting against men like him, men who thought the world could be bought and shaped however they pleased. And now here he was, offering her the kind of money that could actually make a difference, knowing damn well how hard it would be to say no. She hated that he was right. Jean watched her calm and patient, like a predator who knew its prey was cornered. "I have conditions," she said finally, her voice cool but firm. His smirk deepened, but he nodded. Naturally. "I run Rise Up my way. No interference. No opinions from you or your people." "Done. If at any point I feel compromised, I walk. No press, no PR disasters. You let me go, and you still honor your financial commitment." Jean studied her for a moment before giving a slow nod. Agreed. Ellie's nails dug into her palms. Everything about this felt wrong. And yet, she wasn't just making a decision for herself. She was making it for the single mothers sleeping in shelters, the kids falling through the cracks of a system that didn't care, the elderly being pushed out of their homes. She hated him for putting her in this position. But she hated the idea of walking away from what this money could do even more. So she forced herself to breathe, to steady her voice, and said, "Fine." Jean extended a hand across the desk. Ellie stared at it for a long moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, his skin warm, steady, but all she felt was cold. The wedding came fast. Too fast. Ellie barely had time to breathe before she found herself standing in the middle of it, trapped in a world that wasn't hers, wearing a dress that wasn't her style, saying vows she didn't believe in. Jean had planned everything with ruthless efficiency. There had been no drawn-out engagement, no meetings with florists or tastings for the perfect cake. Just a contract, a date, and an expectation that Ellie would fall in line. And now, here she was. The venue was breathtaking in its extravagance. An exclusive estate just outside the city, draped in white roses and golden lights. The kind of place where power brokers gathered, where deals were made over glasses of aged whiskey. Every detail was curated for the press, from the guest list of Wall Street elites to the discreetly stationed photographers capturing Jean Hackman's grand display of transformation. To the outside world, it was a love story. To Ellie, it was a transaction, and she was the currency. She stood at the altar in a simple ivory gown, her choice, despite Jean's assistant pushing designer options that dripped with wealth. The fabric was soft against her skin, but she felt none of its comfort. Around her, guests whispered, smiling, speculating. Jean stood beside her, sharp in a tailored black suit, the embodiment of confidence and control. He looked every bit the billionaire groom, composed, charming, untouched by nerves. But there was something in his eyes, something that flickered for just a moment when he met her gaze. She couldn't tell if it was satisfaction or something else. Then the officiant spoke. And just like that, it was done. A kiss, a press of lips, cold and fleeting, for the sake of appearance. Then applause. Flashes. A perfectly timed embrace. Ellie's stomach churned as Jean led her down the aisle, his hand firm on her lower back. She wanted to pull away, to step out of the frame, but she didn't. She had agreed to this. She had made this choice, not for herself, for Rise Up. The reception was even worse. Jean moved through the room with effortless ease, shaking hands, making toasts, charming investors. To anyone watching, he was the image of a devoted husband, his arm resting lightly around Ellie's waist when the cameras turned their way. But there was no warmth in his touch, no whispered words meant just for her. She was a prop, positioned and repositioned for effect, her presence designed to soften his edges. Ellie sat at the head table, barely touching the champagne in front of her, listening as guests spoke about her as if she weren't there. "She's an interesting choice," one woman murmured, swirling her wine. "Not the usual type." "She's good for his image," another man chuckled. "Gives him that man of the people angle. Smart move." Ellie's grip tightened around the stem of her glass. She glanced at Jean, who was deep in conversation with a senator, his posture relaxed, his smile easy. He didn't even glance her way. This wasn't a marriage. It was a merger. And she was just another piece of the deal. By the time the evening ended, Ellie felt drained, emotionally, physically, in every way that mattered. She had smiled through the photographs, danced when expected, played the part Jean needed her to play. But as they arrived at his penthouse, towering above the city, the weight of it all pressed down on her. The doors closed behind them with a soft click, sealing them in. Jean loosened his tie, exhaling as he poured himself a drink. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the woman he had just legally bound himself to. Ellie didn't wait for an invitation. She picked up her bag, the one she had packed earlier, knowing exactly how this night would end, and walked down the hall. Jean turned, brow lifting. "Where are you going?" She didn't stop. "Guest room." Silence stretched between them, thick and charged. Then, "You're my wife." Ellie paused, hand on the door handle. She turned just enough to meet his gaze, her voice even. "No, Jean. I'm your business arrangement." Then she stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. And for the first time that night, she felt like she had reclaimed something that was hers. The days that followed were cold, efficient, distant. Jean lived his life as if nothing had changed. He went to meetings, closed deals, attended events where Ellie was expected to stand beside him, smiling on cue. She, in turn, threw herself into Rise Up. With Jean's funding secured, the non-profit expanded, programs grew, lives were changed. The work grounded her, reminded her why she had agreed to this madness in the first place. But the tension between them simmered, just beneath the surface. They didn't argue, they barely spoke. Jean didn't ask about her work. Ellie didn't ask about his. They were strangers, orbiting around each other, bound by a contract neither of them fully understood. One day, Ellie invites Jean to visit Rise Up. Gene Hackman was not a man accustomed to being ignored. Yet, Ellie James moved through his penthouse like he was just another expensive fixture, acknowledged only when necessary, otherwise dismissed with the same quiet efficiency as one of his staff. It was starting to get under his skin. At first, he found it amusing, challenging even. He had expected resistance, but he also knew how to wear people down. Money always did the trick, or charm, or power. Ellie seemed immune to all three. She woke up early, spent the entire day at Rise Up, and returned late, exhausted, her mind still buried in work. She was always on the phone, reviewing reports, scheduling meetings, discussing community outreach programs, like her life depended on it. Gene watched, waiting for her to adjust, to bend. She didn't. And the longer it went on, the more it annoyed him. One evening, he decided to push. The event was a charity gala, one of those overpriced affairs where Manhattan's elite gathered under chandeliers, pretending they gave a damn about the less fortunate. Gene knew the game well. These people didn't donate out of kindness. They did it for tax breaks and photo ops. Ellie would hate it, which was exactly why he insisted she go. "This is important," Gene said, leaning against the kitchen counter as she rifled through paperwork. Ellie didn't look up. "Not to me." He exhaled sharply, setting his glass down with just enough force to make a sound. "It's a fundraiser, Ellie. The kind that brings in money. Money that could help your precious rise up." Now she looked at him. Her expression was unreadable, but something flickered behind her eyes. Something that close to disdain. "I don't take money from people who only give so they can feel better about themselves." Gene smirked, shaking his head. "That's naive." Ellie set her pen down. "And you think dragging me to a party full of billionaires patting themselves on the back is going to change my mind?" "Yes," he said simply. Her lips pressed into a tight line. Gene could feel the moment hanging between them, stretching thin. Then she stood, gathering her papers, effectively ending the conversation. "Enjoy your party, Gene." She walked away before he could say anything else. And that was when he felt it. The first stirrings of something he didn't recognize. Frustration. And not because she had said no, but because, for the first time in a long time, Gene Hackman wasn't getting what he wanted. So, a week passed before the next fight. It started small, a conversation over breakfast that quickly spiraled into something sharper, something edged. "I've been looking over Rise Up's numbers," Gene said casually, flipping through a document Samantha had given him. "There's potential to expand, bring in bigger donors, corporate sponsorships." Ellie barely glanced at him. "Not interested." He lowered the paper. "You don't even know what I'm suggesting." "I know exactly what you're suggesting." She took a sip of coffee. "And I'm not turning Rise Up into a PR stunt for men like you." His jaw tightened. "Men like me." Ellie met his gaze, steady, unmoving. "Rich men who think throwing money at a problem makes them saviors." Gene let out a sharp laugh. "Newsflash, sweetheart. Without rich men like me, your little nonprofit wouldn't survive." The second the words left his mouth, he knew they were the wrong ones. Ellie's entire body went still. Then, slowly, she set her cup down. "You think I built Rise Up because I needed someone like you to come in and save it?" Gene didn't answer. Ellie leaned forward, her voice quiet but cutting. "I started this from nothing. No investors, no million-dollar accounts. Just me and the people who actually give a damn." She stood, pushing back her chair. "I'll keep fighting for it. with or without your money." Then she walked out, leaving Jean sitting there, gripping the edges of the paper like it might crumble under his hands. He had won every argument in his life. But this didn't feel like winning. It felt like losing something he didn't even know he wanted. Jean wasn't sure why he agreed to go. It wasn't an obligation. Not really. Ellie hadn't framed it that way. There was no "you have to" or "it's part of the deal." She had simply handed him the invitation to the Rise Up event, her expression neutral, her voice flat. "This Saturday. Come if you want to understand." Then she had walked away, leaving the card on the marble counter next to the untouched espresso he had made that morning. Jean had stared at it for a long time, and now, here he was. The neighborhood was nothing like the world he knew. The streets were cracked, worn at the edges, lined with corner stores and laundromats that had seen better days. People moved with a certain weariness, their shoulders hunched against a reality that never seemed to give them a break. Jean sat in the back seat of his car, his fingers drumming against the leather interior. He wasn't nervous. Gene Hackman didn't do nervous. But there was something unsettling about being in a place where his name meant nothing. Ellie was waiting for him outside a converted warehouse, now painted in vibrant murals, images of hope, of struggle, of hands reaching toward something better. Kids ran through the open doors, their laughter rising above the hum of conversation. Volunteers in blue rise-up shirts moved between tables stacked with food, books, supplies. She saw him before he stepped out. Her expression didn't change. No smugness. No, "I told you so." Just a nod. "You came." Gene adjusted his cufflinks. "I said I would." Ellie didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Come on," she said, already moving. Inside, the air was thick with life. Jean followed as Ellie moved through the space, greeting people with an ease that came from years of being part of this world. He saw the way they responded to her, not with fear or forced politeness, but with something else. Respect. Trust. It was jarring. People looked at him differently. Suspicion. Caution. Jean knew that look. He had seen it in boardrooms, when men wondered whether they were sitting across from a predator or a potential ally. But here, it wasn't about money or power. It was something deeper. They didn't trust him because they knew men like him didn't belong in places like this. Ellie led him to a table where a group of mothers sorted through donated clothes. "This is Maria," Ellie said, gesturing toward a woman folding a stack of neatly pressed baby onesies. "She's been with Rise Up for 3 years now." Maria looked up, wiping her hands on her jeans before shaking Jean's hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes sharp, assessing him. "You're Ellie's husband," she said, like it was still up for debate. Jean smirked. "So, they tell me." Maria didn't return the smile. "You don't look like a man who spends much time in places like this." "I don't." Jean didn't bother pretending otherwise. She studied him for a moment before nodding, like that was enough honesty for her to tolerate. "You want to help? Grab a box." Jean didn't move. He wasn't the kind of man who grabbed boxes. Ellie arched a brow. "Something wrong?" Jean exhaled, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt before reaching for the nearest container of canned goods. It didn't get easier. Jean watched as Ellie led him deeper into her world, introducing him to the people she fought for. A single mother balancing a toddler on her hip, exhaustion heavy in her eyes. A young boy flipping through a book with torn pages, his small fingers tracing the words as he whispered them aloud. An elderly man clutching a bag of food like it was the most valuable thing he'd ever owned. Jean had seen numbers like these before, on spreadsheets, in reports. Poverty rates, housing statistics, unemployment projections. But numbers didn't look like this. Numbers didn't have faces. Numbers didn't smile at Ellie like she had just given them a reason to keep going. Jean felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Unease. Later, as the event wound down, he found Ellie stacking chairs in the main hall. "You do this every week?" he asked, watching as she wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Sometimes more," she said. "Depends on what's needed." Jean was silent for a moment, then, "You could have taken the money and walked away." Ellie glanced at him. "What? You could have married me, taken the funding, and let someone else deal with this." He gestured vaguely at the room, at the people still lingering, at the weight of everything she had chosen to carry. "But you didn't." Ellie's expression was unreadable. Then she said simply, "Because that's not who I am." Jean didn't know what to say to that. He had spent his whole life making calculated moves, ensuring every deal benefited him in the end. He didn't do selfless. He didn't do thankless work with no guaranteed reward. And yet, he had seen the way they looked at Ellie, like she mattered, like she wasn't just another person passing through. He had spent his life chasing power, building an empire, making himself untouchable. And, for the first time, Jean wondered if he had been looking for the wrong kind of wealth. The first time Jean showed up at Rise Up on his own, no one quite knew what to make of it. He wasn't dressed in one of his tailored suits, though the crisp button-down and rolled sleeves still set him apart from the volunteers in their faded t-shirts and well-worn jeans. He wasn't standing at a distance this time, observing like a man watching a world he didn't belong to. Instead, he walked in like he had a purpose. He didn't announce himself, didn't seek Ellie out. He simply found the nearest stack of donation boxes and started unpacking them. At first, no one spoke to him. They stole glances, exchanged quiet murmurs. Maria, always the first to speak her mind, eyed him warily as she sorted through canned goods. "Thought rich men had better things to do," she muttered, barely loud enough to be heard. Jean didn't rise to the bait. He just kept working. Minutes turned into hours, and still, he stayed. He carried crates of supplies, stacked chairs, wiped down tables. By midday, sweat darkened the back of his shirt, and his hands that had only ever known boardrooms and billion-dollar contracts, were smudged with dust and ink from sorting books for the literacy program. And still, no one quite trusted him. Jean knew why. A man like him didn't change overnight. Even Ellie, watching from across the room, didn't look convinced. She saw the way the volunteers observed him, their skepticism etched into every glance. She understood it. Gene Hackman had walked into their world as a man who had never needed to worry about the things they did, where the next meal would come from, whether there'd be enough money left to keep the lights on, if the rent increase this year would finally be the one that pushed them out. Men like him made promises, but their kind of charity was always transactional. They wrote checks, attended galas, posed for photos. But they didn't show up like this. They didn't sweat alongside the people they claimed to help. Yet, here he was. She watched as he crouched down next to a boy, no older than 8, who was struggling with his reading. Jean didn't rush him, didn't offer easy praise. He pointed to the words, patient, nodding as the boy stumbled through the syllables. When the child finally got it right, Jean said something that made the kid grin wide, his small shoulders straightening with pride. Ellie's stomach twisted. It would be easier if this were just another game for him. Because if it wasn't, if this change was real, then she had to face something she wasn't ready to. Jean didn't question why Ellie kept her distance. She watched him, assessed him like she was waiting for the moment he'd prove her right. That this was all temporary, just another move in a long game. And maybe, once, it would have been. But Jean found himself returning to rise up every day without understanding exactly why. He told himself it was just curiosity, that he wanted to see what Ellie had built, to understand why she had chosen this life instead of the comfort she could have had. But the more time he spent there, the harder it became to pretend that was the only reason. The work was exhausting in a way he wasn't used to. It didn't come with power plays or negotiations, no clear path to victory. And yet, for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about winning. Then came Emmett. Jean hadn't seen him in weeks, which was unusual. Emmett was the kind of man who liked to stay close to the bets he made, to watch the pieces move. But when he finally did reach out, it wasn't for a casual check-in. Jean should have expected it. The restaurant was private, expensive, the kind of place where men like them sealed multi-million-dollar deals over dry-aged steak and aged whiskey. Emmett was already seated when Jean arrived, leaning back in his chair, amusement dancing in his sharp eyes. "Well, well," he drawled, swirling his drink, "was starting to think you forgot about me." Jean sat down, signaling the waiter for a drink. "Been busy." "That's what I hear." Emmett smirked. "Playing house, doing the whole community man routine? Gotta say, it's a hell of a performance." Jean didn't react. Emmett leaned forward. "But you do remember what this is, don't you?" Silence. Then, soft, deliberate, Emmett said, 6 months, Jean. The bet's almost up." The words landed like a fist to the ribs. Jean had spent weeks buried in Rise Up, in Ellie's world, in something that didn't feel like a game. But the second Emmett spoke, the truth of it came crashing back. He had built his entire life around control, around knowing exactly where every move would lead. But now, he wasn't sure what he had set in motion. Because if Ellie ever found out... Jean clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the table. "I know." Emmett studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you?" Jean didn't answer, because for the first time he wasn't sure he did. The confession sat heavy in his chest. It should have been easy, telling Ellie. Gene Hackman had never struggled with words before. He had cut deals worth billions with nothing but his voice. He had manipulated, convinced, negotiated men twice his age into giving him exactly what he wanted. But this wasn't business. This was Ellie. And if he told her the truth, if she found out that their marriage had started as nothing more than a challenge, he knew exactly how it would end. She would walk away. Not just from him. From Rise Up's funding. From everything he had tried to build between them, whatever fragile thing it was. And the worst part, he wouldn't even blame her. So he stood in the kitchen that night, watching as Ellie sorted through paperwork at the table, the words burning in his throat. He had to tell her before she heard it from someone else, before Emmett decided to play his own game, before the truth became a weapon instead of a confession. But when Ellie finally looked up, meeting his gaze with quiet, guarded curiosity, the words wouldn't come. For the first time in his life, Gene Hackman was afraid, not of losing, but of losing her. Gene had always believed that control was his greatest asset. Every decision, every move he made was calculated. He didn't take risks he couldn't manage, never played a hand unless he knew the odds. were in his favor. That's what had built his empire, what had made him Gene Hackman, untouchable, always 3 steps ahead. But tonight, standing in the middle of his penthouse, watching Ellie walk through the door, he felt something slip. She set her bag on the counter, sighing as she flipped through a stack of mail. "Long day," she murmured, not looking up. "One of the new volunteers quit. Said the work was too much." Gene barely heard her. His pulse pounded in his ears, the weight of what he had to say pressing down on him like a vice. "Ellie." She paused, sensing something in his tone, then turned. Gene swallowed, his throat dry. He'd spent weeks avoiding this moment, letting the lie stretch, convincing himself he had time. But time had run out. He had to tell her before she heard it from someone else. "There's something you need to know." Ellie frowned, crossing her arms. "What is it?" Gene exhaled, slow and unsteady. "When we got married..." He hesitated just for a second, but there was no turning back now. It wasn't just about the image. It started as a bet. Silence. For a moment, Ellie didn't react. She just stared at him, the words sinking in, settling into the cracks of whatever fragile trust had been built between them. Then, "A bet?" Her voice was quiet, dangerously so. Gene forced himself to nod. "Yes." Ellie blinked, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a short, hollow laugh, shaking her head. "I knew it." Her voice broke, just slightly. "I knew there was something. I should have trusted my instincts." Gene stepped forward. "Ellie, listen." "No." She held up a hand, stopping him cold. "Don't you dare try to explain." Her breathing had changed, sharp and uneven, as if the realization was hitting in waves, each one worse than the last. "This whole time," she whispered, her voice shaking, "I thought maybe I'd been too hard on you, that maybe you weren't just some rich bastard playing games. But that's exactly what this was to you, wasn't it? A game." "No." Gene shook his head, his gut twisting. "Not anymore. It started that way, but it changed. I changed." Ellie let out another laugh, this one harsher, bitter. "You changed? Do you even hear yourself?" She gestured around the room, at the towering windows, the gleaming floors, the world he had built for himself. "People like you don't change, Gene. You just find new ways to manipulate people." Gene clenched his jaw. "That's not fair." Ellie's eyes flashed. "Fair?" She stepped closer, her voice rising. "You think fair is lying to someone for months, making them believe that maybe, just maybe, what they were starting to feel was real. I was stupid enough to think you actually cared." "I do care," Gene said, his voice low, raw. Ellie shook her head. "You don't even know what that means." The words hit harder than he expected. Gene had spent his life winning. Even when things got messy, he found a way to come out on top. He always had an exit strategy, an angle to play. But there was no strategy here. No angle. No way to undo what had just happened. Ellie turned away, grabbing her bag. Gene's chest tightened. "Ellie, don't." She didn't stop. "Don't walk away." She turned back, eyes burning. "You don't get to ask me that." Gene didn't know what to say. For the first time in his life, words failed him. Ellie's voice dropped, quieter now, but somehow heavier. "Screw your change, Gene. It means nothing when it started with a lie." And then she was gone. The penthouse was too quiet without her. Gene stood in the center of the room, staring at the door she had just walked through, the sound of her footsteps still echoing in his ears. He had lost deals before, watched partnerships dissolve, fortunes disappear overnight. But none of it had ever felt like this. This wasn't about losing control. This was loss. And he didn't know how to fix it. He had built his entire life around the idea that money could solve anything, that power could keep him untouchable. But money hadn't stopped Ellie from walking away. Power hadn't made her stay. Gene sat down heavily on the couch, running a hand through his hair. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably Emmett, probably some smug message about how he should have known better than to let this go too far. Gene didn't check his phone. He already knew what Emmett wanted to say, knew the kind of smug satisfaction that would be woven into his words. Told you so. Should have never gotten involved. You were always too confident, Hackman. Instead, he let the silence settle around him. For the first time in his life, he didn't try to fill it with numbers or distractions or plans for his next move. He just sat there, staring at the city spread beneath him, feeling the weight of something he couldn't name pressing against his chest. Ellie was gone. She had walked away without looking back, her voice still ringing in his head, edged with betrayal, with hurt. He had expected anger, had braced for it, but he hadn't expected the way her words would feel like something breaking inside him. Screw your change, Gene. It means nothing when it started with a lie. And maybe she was right. Maybe nothing he did from this point forward would matter because of the way it had begun. But that didn't mean he would stop trying. Ellie threw herself into Rise Up, pushing harder than before, working longer hours, expanding programs, meeting with new volunteers, making sure the people who depended on her didn't suffer because of her personal mistakes. Because that's what Gene Hackman had been. A mistake. Letting him in. Trusting him, even just a little. Seeing something in him that might have been real. She hated herself for it. But more than that, she hated that even now, especially now, he was still in her head. The way he had looked at her, as if he wanted to say something else. The way he had started showing up, not as the billionaire with an agenda, but as a man who seemed like he was finally seeing the world for the first time. The problem was, she didn't know if that version of Gene was real, and she didn't have the energy to figure it out. So, she worked. She buried herself in it, but no matter how much she distracted herself, it was impossible to ignore that Gene hadn't disappeared. He wasn't sending flowers or gifts or grand gestures. He wasn't trying to talk his way out of what he had done. Instead, he kept showing up at Rise Up, not as a donor, not as the man funding the entire operation, but as a volunteer. And it infuriated her. She saw him lifting crates, helping to renovate one of the new buildings, sitting with a group of unemployed men, talking them through the basics of job applications and interviews. He never sought attention, never played it up for the cameras, and, most infuriating of all, he didn't approach her. It was like he had accepted her decision, but refused to let it dictate his own. And that, more than anything, was what made her start to question everything. The letter arrived at the opening of Rise Up's new center, a moment that should have been purely celebratory, a symbol of everything they had built. Gene had been there, of course, standing on the edges, blending in with the other volunteers, making no move to speak to her. And maybe that's why, when Maria pressed the envelope into her hand, saying only, "It's from him," Ellie didn't throw it away. She waited until she was alone that night back in her apartment before she opened it. The handwriting was neat, precise. No wasted words, no over-explaining. "Ellie, I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm still here. Not because of the bet, not because of guilt, but because this work has changed me. I can't undo how it started, but I can decide what I do from here. You don't have to believe me. Nah, you don't have to trust me. but I'll still be here. Because this matters. Because you were right." Ellie sat there for a long time, staring at the words, feeling the weight of them settle into her bones. She had been waiting for an apology, for some elaborate attempt to win her back. She hadn't expected this. Jean didn't expect her to respond. Didn't expect anything, really. He just kept doing the work, pouring himself into something that, for the first time in his life, wasn't about winning or controlling or shaping a narrative. And maybe that's why, when Ellie finally approached him one afternoon, he felt something dangerously close to hope. She stood in front of him, arms crossed, her expression guarded, but not as closed off as before. "I need to ask you something," she said, voice steady. Jean set down the stack of papers he had been sorting. "Go ahead." Ellie met his gaze, searching his face as if she could still find the truth buried somewhere between the lies. "If the bet had never existed," she said slowly, carefully, "would you have ever met me? Would you have ever come into my world?" Jean didn't look away, didn't try to come up with the right answer, the one that would make everything okay. "I don't know," he admitted, voice quiet but firm. Ellie's jaw tightened, but she didn't move, didn't walk away. "But if I could do it over," Jean continued, "I'd want to meet you because of you. Not because of a game, not because someone else dared me to." He exhaled. "If I could change how it started, I would." Ellie studied him for a long moment, then nodded, just once. She didn't give him an answer that day, but she didn't walk away either. And that, Jean thought, was enough. The next months were different. They weren't bound by a contract anymore. There was no bet hanging over them, no performance for the public eye. Jean continued his work with Rise Up, not as a man trying to prove something, but as someone who had found meaning beyond himself. He used his influence to bring in new investors, to expand the programs, to ensure that Rise Up would never have to struggle for funding again. And Ellie, she didn't forgive him overnight, didn't forget the way he had hurt her. But little by little, she let down her guard. Not for the man he had been, but for the man he was becoming. The night of Rise Up's largest event, they stood together, side by side, watching as people filled the room. People whose lives had changed because of the work they had done. Not because of money, not because of power, because of something real. Jean glanced at Ellie. "Thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For changing me." Ellie held his gaze for a long moment, then finally she smiled. "Just don't change back." At its core, this story is not just about romance or wealth. It's about transformation, redemption, and the struggle between self-interest and genuine change. Gene Hackman starts as a man who believes power and control can buy anything, including love, reputation, and influence. But through his journey with Ellie and Rise Up, he learns that real value lies not in money or status, but in human connection, in purpose beyond himself. Ellie, on the other hand, embodies resilience and integrity. She never compromises her values, even when faced with betrayal and heartbreak. She teaches Jean and the reader that trust is not something given lightly. It must be earned. Her journey is just as powerful, proving that sometimes letting go of pain is just as important as standing firm in one's beliefs. The story beautifully illustrates that true change is not instant, but earned through actions, not words. It teaches us that redemption is possible, but only when it comes from a place of sincerity. In the end, Jean doesn't win Ellie back with grand gestures. He does it by becoming a better man. And that is the most powerful lesson of all. Change is real when it's chosen, not performed. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.